In the previous lessons, we've been learning about all of the different exponent rules. Let's quickly summarize what they were, and then what we're going to do is we're going to use all 4 of them together in this lesson. So we're going to have questions like that, and a whole bunch of others coming up. Okay, so exponent rule 1, exponent rule 2, and then we did 3 and 4. Okay, so with the first one, we had something like 2 to the 3 times by 2 to the 5. And what we learned was when the bases are the same, what do we do with the exponents? We add. Because we're multiplying over here, we add the exponents. And so that became 2 to the power of 8. That was the first type we looked at. With exponent rule number 2, we had something like 3 to the 8 divided by 3 to the 2. And what we learnt, when the bases are the same and you're dividing, then what do you do with the exponents? Well, first of all, you leave the base. You don't change the base. And then what do you do with the exponents? You minus them. And so 8 minus 2, I was going to say 8 minus 2 over here, but 8 minus 2 is 6. Okay? And then we learnt if you have something like 3 to the power of 2, and then there's a number on the outside here, then what you do is you leave the base. You see how we always leave the base, okay? And then what we learned was that we multiply those numbers together. And then the last one we learned is a very easy one. If you have anything to the power of 0, then the answer becomes a 1. So anything to the power of 0. So anything to the power of 0 equals 1. Okay, so those are the different things you need to understand. If you don't understand them, then you need to go watch some of those lessons. Make sure you understand all of the exponent rules, because now we are going to go and practice all of them combined. And so now we're going to do a whole bunch of examples, but I've left these 4 little rules. Now remember, these are just example rules, okay? So what I'm trying to show you is that when you have a situation like this, where you're multiplying, you leave the bases the same, and then you add, because 3 plus 5 is 8. When you get something like this, you leave the base the same, and then you subtract, okay? And then here you leave the base the same, and then you multiply. And then anything to the power of 0 is 1. Those are the 4 rules you need to know. So let's begin. Here we're going to just go from left to right. So here we have a situation that looks like a divide. So what do we know? We know that you keep the 2 the same, so it stays a 2, right? And then what do we do with these exponents? You subtract them. So what is 8 take away 3? That'll be 5. Okay, so we've done these 2, and now we're just going to say that over there. Okay, now it looks like we have a situation where we have a rule number 1. So what do? We know that we keep the bases the same. You see how the 2 and the 2 stays a 2. You mustn't say 2 times 2 is 4. And then what do you do with these ones? Well, you add them. How easy is this, guys? If you just follow your rules, it's pretty straightforward. So the final answer will be 2 to the power of 9. Let's do a couple more. Okay, so this looks really intimidating, right? But now you could think of this in different ways. You could say, okay, should we start using rule number 3 because we've got a bracket? Or what could we do? Well, there's different, you could do it like that if you want to, not a problem. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to start inside the bracket. So I'm going to say, okay, we have a rule number 1 over there. So we know that we are going to keep it as a 3, and then we're going to add the exponents. Okay, and then we have that. But I keep the bracket because I didn't do anything with the bracket yet. Now I'm going to keep looking inside here, and I'm going to say, okay, this looks like a rule number 2. And so what rule number 2 tells us is that you keep the base the same, and then what do you do with these numbers? You minus them. So what is 6 minus 5? That is a 1. And now we have this. Now, all of a sudden, we are at a situation that looks like rule number 3. And so what rule number 3 tells us to do is you keep the base the same. Can you see that? You keep the base the same. And then what do you do with these two numbers? You multiply them, right? So what are we going to do with those two numbers? We're going to multiply them. And there is your answer. Now, what if you wanted to rather do this in a different way? Okay, so method, for those of you that are happy with this, you can go ahead to the next one. But for those of you that maybe wanted to try it in a different way, well, what you could do is 3 to the 4 times 3 to the 2 divided by 3 to the 5. So maybe because you looked at this and you said, that looks like this. That's absolutely fine. So what we do is we're going to take this one, and what do we do with these numbers? You multiply them. So that's going to become 3 to the power of 12. Then you're just going to do it with this one as well. So what does that become? Well, that becomes 3 to the power of 6, because remember, we are multiplying. And then you can say divide. Whoa, that's a horrible divide. And then you're going to say 3 multiplied by 5, which is 15. There we go. Now, going into the next step, you could say, oh, that's rule number 1. So what do? We keep the 3's the same. And then what do we do with these exponents? We add them. So what do we do with these exponents? We add them. And that's 18. Now, this is rule number 2, because we're dividing. So what do? We keep it as a 3. And then what do we do with these numbers? Well, what did we do over here? You subtract. So we're going to say 18 minus 15, which is 3. Hello, hello, same answer, right? So with this one, I would start right here in the beginning, and I can immediately say, oh, that is definitely a rule number 3. And in fact, it looks almost exactly the same. So what we do is we keep it as a 3, and then what are we supposed to do with these two numbers? Well, we multiply. So what is 2 multiplied by 4? 8. Then I write all the rest down as the same. Okay, now that is rule number 1. So what do? We keep it as a 3, and what do we do with these two numbers? Well, what did we do over here? We add them, okay? So 8 plus 2 is 10. Now we have a rule number 2. So with rule number 2, when you're dividing, we keep these numbers the same, so that'll be a 3. And then what do we do with these numbers? Well, over here, we subtract. So that means we're going to say 10 minus 5, which is 5. Okay, here is our next one. So immediately I look at this and I see that it's to the power of 0. And from rule number 4, we know that anything to the power of 0 is 1. So anything to the power of 0 is a 1. Okay, so that takes a lot of, well, that simplifies things nicely for us. Now, you can just ignore this 1, because if you say 1 times 4, it's 4. If you say 1 times 10, it's 10. So by putting a 1 there, can you see that it doesn't change the number? Okay, so we don't need to have this 1 over here. So we can actually just rewrite this entire thing as that. Because 1 multiplied by 3 to the 5 is 3 to the 5. Okay, now here is rule number 2. So, oh, and it's actually exactly written as we had the examples over here. So remember, these are just examples, eh? So we know then that if you have a 3 to the 5 and a 3 to the 2, it stays a 3. And then what do you do with these exponents? You subtract them. And so that'll become 3 to the 3. Here's our last example. So immediately, you could take these two together, or you could take all 3 of these together if you want to. I'm going to take all 3 together. We know that when these are all the same and you're multiplying, that is rule number 1. So with rule number 1, you keep it as a 2, and then what do you do with these numbers? You add them. So what is 6 plus 3 plus 4? That is 13. Okay? And then divide, and then let's just go write this down. Okay, now if you look at this part, that is a rule number 3. And so what then happens, divide, is that you keep it as a 2, and then what do you do here? Well, what did we do over here? We multiply, so that'll be 2 to the 10. Now all of a sudden we have a divide, so that is rule number 2. And so that'll become 2, And then what do we do with these numbers? You subtract. So what is 13 minus 10? 3.